This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 3, Decipherment. In this lesson, we'll talk about how decipherments start. So far we've talked about how the prerequisites that we need to start a decipherment. So once those prerequisites have been satisfied, how do we actually begin performing the decipherment? Well, firstly, one thing that we can do is do a structural or distributional analysis. So what this means is that we take note of the fact that linguistic elements often occur more commonly than others. So there are some words which we know occur more commonly than others, some sounds which we know occur more commonly than letters, and letters similarly as well. And if you know what the most frequent words, for example, in a language are, it is actually quite a very helpful thing, because in the vocabulary frequency of every language is very unevenly distributed. The most frequent words account for a very large portion of any given text. So to give an example, if you look at texts from the Project Gutenberg, a collection of a bunch of literature, the most common 100 words in English make up 44.7% of the text. So this gives you a good idea as to, if you're deciphering a representation of English, you know which words to look for. So making these kinds of assumptions can help you get started with the decipherment. And also remember that in the decipherment of linear B, Alice Kober's work in distributional analysis was also very helpful, seeing which symbols tend to occur with other symbols. So yeah, also remember that some pairs of linguistic elements occur more commonly with other linguistic elements. So yeah, for example, in English, we know that TH is a very common letter combination, much more than QX, for example. That might not occur at all even. So using this kind of analysis, that can help us narrow down our possible assumptions in our decipherment. So think back to when I did the example of the cryptogram. These kinds of structural assumptions or statistical assumptions were things that I made. And so structural analysis, also known as distributional analysis, basically uses statistical information to get a better sense of the writing system. So this is a really important component to begin a decipherment. Another way a decipherment can begin is by using names. So we saw in multiple of our example decipherments that this is how the decipherment started. So the reason why names are so helpful is that they often tend to be written with the same sounds regardless of what language is actually being used. And that's a really helpful thing to know. So for this reason, we were able to decipher Old Persian because we know about the names of Darius and Xerxes, and we could use that to begin that process, as Grotevend had shown. So that means that names are often a good point to actually start a decipherment. And also remember, in the case of Egyptian hieroglyphics, names were specially indicated in the text with cartouches, which it's unusual for names to be as highlighted in that way, and to make it really easy for us to find out where the names are. But this just goes to show how important names are for this as well. And now these names can refer to famous people, but they can also refer to place names as well. So that was helpful for the decipherment of linear B. Another way that we could do a decipherment is using the Rebus and Acrophonic principles. Think back to module 1 about that. So writing systems that we found, especially phonetic writing systems, which use pictographic symbols, they commonly use the Rebus and Acrophonic principles to represent kinds of language information. So if you know have a good assumption as to what the underlying language is, and you know what the pictograph represents, then you can use that to figure out what that symbol might represent sound-wise. So if we assume that the acrophonic principle is being used, then we can say, well, the first sound of that word in our assumed language, that might be what the symbol it represents. Or and similarly for the Rebus principle, maybe that's that the name of that symbol is being used in another context. So an example of where this happened from our decipherments is where we looked at the sun symbol. This was an observation made by Champollion, that the sun symbol, which in the Coptic language is pronounced re, that might be used for an R sound. So using the acrophonic principle helped him come to that conclusion. Yeah, another very helpful way for phonetic decipherment, which sometimes can be very helpful, is to look at an example of a similar writing system. So we know from our unit on writing systems that many writing systems are descended from earlier writing systems, making only minor modifications. And so this kind of thing is pretty helpful if we want to do a decipherment, because we already know what a lot of the symbols might represent. So for example, we know that the Phoenician writing system it developed into the Greek writing system, which developed into the Etruscan alphabet, which developed into the Latin alphabet. Now, the Etruscan language was actually something that was lost to history. Yeah, we don't have many records of that, but since the Etruscan writing system is so similar to Latin, we are able to read much of Etruscan texts and perform decipherment in that way and learn much about the Etruscan language. And we could do this because these writing systems are so similar to each other. And we can hypothesize that similar looking symbols might represent similar sounds. So we could use this to decipher Etruscan, as I said, even though the language is extinct. That being said, just because symbols look alike doesn't mean they represent the same sounds. So this strategy doesn't always work. It only works when the languages are related. So to give an important counterexample, if you look at the Cherokee syllabary, which we talked about a little bit in Module 2, the syllabary was based off of the appearance of Latin letters, but what the sounds that they actually represent isn't anything like the original sounds. So using this this kind of idea that we've talked about to do start decipherment by the idea that similar symbols represent similar sounds doesn't work well for Cherokee. And sometimes symbols might be similar to each other just by chance. Just if you're drawing a simple symbol, it's highly likely that they might be very similar to each other. So using a similar writing system could help a decipherment, but it does not always help. So that's an important thing to remember. And another very helpful thing is to use examples of bilingual and multilingual texts. So many artifacts will contain the same text written in multiple languages or in different scripts. And if we know one language, it can very greatly help us decipher the other. The probably most famous example of this is the Rosetta Stone in the top right here. Now, an important thing about bilingual texts is that they are helpful for a decipherment, but they're not actually necessary. So we've talked about some writing systems which have been deciphered without any bilingual texts, such as Old Persian and Linear B. Those were deciphered just with the texts alone. But the bilingual texts are very, very helpful if they are available. So the Rosetta Stone was hugely important for the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics because it had a text in a version of the text in the Greek language, and that could be used to determine a lot of the sounds that Egyptian hieroglyphs represented. And bilingual tablets in cuneiform was very important for deciphering all the other languages which cuneiform represented, not just Old Persian, but also Hittite, Akkadian, and Sumerian. So the decipherment of Old Persian gave us the key to decipher all of these other older writing systems, many of which have gone extinct. So bilingual texts can be very helpful. Now, to show an example of why a bilingual text is so helpful, so I know that many of you are Chinese speakers or are students of Chinese, so this particular example might not work as well for you. But say that you're an individual who doesn't read Chinese, but you look at a parallel text here. So here we have the same a passage which comes from the Bible, and the same passage written in Chinese. So we can see that there's certain patterns that the way these words occur in the English text. So, and God said, and God saw, and God called, and God said. And we can see that there's a similar kind of pattern at the beginning of the Chinese sentences as well. So we could probably assume that the first symbol, the very first symbol of the symbols here might be the symbol representing God. And also in the example of the first Chinese sentence, we can see God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So we see that each of those clauses there ends in the word light. And we can also see that at the end of each clause in the Chinese text, that there's the same symbol there as well. And it looks like, it kind of looks like a starburst. So it kind of looks like a pictographic representation of light. So that kind of gives us further evidence that this might be happening. So in bilingual texts, we can see that the same words will occur in the same kinds of places. So it's much easier to figure out which words correspond to which other words. And that's why bilingual texts are so helpful to actually begin a decipherment. So yeah, these are all the ways that we talked about, which can be very helpful for beginning the process of decipherment.